June 12, 2025, 11:47 p.m. Tehran. Major General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, commander of the IRGC Aerospace Forces and the architect of Iran's entire missile program, reviewed the night's intelligence summary in his Tehran compound. His phone buzzed. A routine check-in from one of his subordinates. Nothing alarming. Somewhere deep beneath the Alborz Mountains, uranium was spinning in centrifuges at Fordow, enriched to 60% purity, a threshold that made the entire Western world sweat at night. Iran's missile arsenal, a force of over 2,000 ballistic weapons, sat ready in hardened silos from Kermanshah to Tabriz. General Hajizadeh, one of the most powerful military minds in the Islamic Republic, had spent 20 years building a system designed to deter any enemy from ever daring to touch Iran. He had no idea that at this exact moment, 400 miles away, there were Israeli Air Force pilots climbing into their cockpits. He had no idea that Mossad commando teams had been quietly living inside his country for weeks. He had no idea that this was the last night of his life. What happened in the next 24 hours would shatter everything the world thought it knew about modern warfare, regime survival, and what a small country could do with years of meticulous planning and the most advanced air force in the Middle East. This is a minute-by-minute breakdown of the first 24 hours of Iran's war. If you want to understand the most consequential military operation of the 21st century, hit subscribe right now. Every week we break down history's most dramatic battles with the detail they actually deserve. Hit that button. Let's go. To understand what happened on June 13, 2025, you have to understand the deception that preceded it by exactly 12 hours. On the evening of June 12, Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir attended what looked like a perfectly ordinary public dinner in Tel Aviv. Cameras caught him. Reporters noted his attendance. He smiled. He shook hands. He projected the calm of a man with absolutely nothing on his mind. What nobody in that room could have known was that Zamir had spent the previous weeks conducting the most tightly compartmentalized operational briefings in Israeli military history. The dinner was theater. A deliberate, calculated act of misdirection designed to send one message to Iranian intelligence: nothing is happening tonight. Iranian radar operators were not on heightened alert. Iranian generals had not been dispersed to secondary locations. Iranian missile launchers sat in their normal positions. The Supreme Leadership's protective detail was operating on routine protocols. The Islamic Republic had studied American and Israeli military patterns for decades, building its entire doctrine, what strategists called the mosaic defense, around surviving a first strike by dispersing command, decentralizing control, and overwhelming any attacker with sheer volume of retaliation. The mosaic defense had one fatal flaw. It assumed you would see the attack coming. Just after midnight on June 13, 2025, something strange began happening at select locations deep inside Iran. Not explosions. Not aircraft. Something quieter. More precise. Mossad teams that had been operating covertly inside the country for weeks, building a network that intelligence analysts would later describe as one of the most audacious espionage operations in modern history, activated. Loitering munitions, pre-positioned on Iranian soil, began their final targeting sequences. Drones manufactured and hidden inside Iran itself, not flown in from Israel, spun their rotors to life. Air defense radar stations in western Iran began experiencing inexplicable malfunctions. The Israelis were not shooting arrows yet. They were killing the archers. By the time the first Israeli F-35I broke the Iranian border at altitude, over 40 surface-to-air missile systems had already been neutralized or blinded. The radar operators who were supposed to see them coming were already dead or sitting in front of dark screens that refused to tell them anything useful. 8:10 a.m., Tehran local time, June 13, 2025. The city was fully awake. Morning prayers had ended. Traffic clogged the highways. In a residential compound in northern Tehran, an explosion erupted without warning. Then another. Then another, across a different district entirely. Then Tabriz shook. Then Isfahan. Then Qom. Then Kermanshah. Then Karaj. In the space of a single morning, over 200 Israeli combat aircraft, F-35 is, F-15 is, and F-16 is flying in coordinated multi-wave formations, struck more than 100 targets simultaneously across Iran. Let that number sink in. 200 jets. 100 targets. Simultaneously. Iranian state-linked outlets reported blasts at the Intelligence Ministry in downtown Tehran, the Defense Ministry, the headquarters of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. Khamenei's own office building on Pasteur Street took a direct hit. The Parchin military complex, Iran's most sensitive weapons research site, was rocked by explosions that shook buildings 3 miles away. The Kermanshah missile base, home to some of Iran's most advanced ballistic missile launchers, was struck so comprehensively that satellite imagery released the following day showed the entire complex reduced to a field of craters. But here is what was happening that nobody in Tehran could piece together in real time. While the city burned in a dozen different places at once, 3 of Iran's top 4 military commanders were being killed in precision strikes separated by only minutes. Major General Hossein Salami, Commander-in-Chief of the entire IRGC, dead. Major General Mohammad Bagheri, Chief of the General Staff of Iran's Armed Forces, dead. Major General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, the man who built Iran's missile program, the architect of its aerospace strategy, the officer Tehran considered its most irreplaceable military mind, dead. All 3, in the same morning, simultaneously, identified by Israeli intelligence in real time and struck before any of them could reach their emergency relocation protocols. 40 Iranian commanders killed in the opening wave, including the entire senior leadership of the IRGC aerospace forces, who, according to later reports, had gathered at a specific location in a crisis response pattern that Israeli intelligence had apparently studied and anticipated. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching this from? I want to know how far this story has traveled. At 9:30 a.m., less than 90 minutes after the first explosions, Iran announced the launch of what it called the first wave of Operation True Promise 3. 200 Shahid, 136 loitering drones lifted off from multiple Iranian launch sites and streaked toward Israeli territory. On paper, the numbers sounded terrifying. 200 drones, launched in coordinated salvos. Iran had used this exact weapon against Israel before and caused genuine damage. But something critical had changed since those earlier operations. Iran's most experienced aerospace forces commanders were already dead. The coordinated launch sequencing that would have maximized saturation and overwhelmed Israeli tracking systems never materialized the way the doctrine demanded. The drones came in predictable waves rather than the synchronized swarms Iran had practiced for years. Israeli Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 batteries, backed by American THAAD systems and a U.S. Navy destroyer operating offshore, systematically dismantled the incoming formations. Almost the entire first drone wave was defeated. Interceptor trails streaked across the Israeli sky like silent white signatures of a defense operating exactly as designed. On the Israeli side, sirens screamed from the Galilee to the Negev. In Beersheva, families sprinted for shelters. In Tel Aviv, commuters abandoned cars on highways and ran. In Jerusalem, the iconic skyline flickered with the white flashes of intercepts high above the city. Meanwhile, what happened in Tehran in those same hours was the opposite of the organized Iranian response its military doctrine had promised. There were no emergency civilian shelter protocols, no organized dispersal, no functioning public warning system. Residents described standing in the streets, staring at smoke columns rising from locations they could not identify, with no government guidance, no safe rooms, no instructions. One woman later recounted for journalists that she sat in her apartment listening to distant explosions, unable to tell whether to run or stay, because nobody had ever told her what to do when this day came. Iran's mosaic defense had been designed to survive a decapitation of its leadership. What it had never accounted for was the possibility that its leadership would be decapitated in the first 90 minutes. By mid-morning, the United States had entered the war. Pentagon officials confirmed the American codename, Operation Epic Fury. U.S. attack aircraft launched from multiple bases across the Middle East and from carrier strike groups in the region. The initial American focus was the southwestern corner of Iran, IRGC naval assets, the port infrastructure at Bandar Abbas, the patrol boat squadrons and mine-laying vessels that Tehran had always planned to use as its last resort, choking the Strait of Hormuz and turning off the global oil supply. The Americans moved to take that card off the table within the first hours. Smoke rose from Bandar Abbas by early afternoon. Simultaneously, Iran launched ballistic missiles at 4 American bases across the Gulf region. Al-Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Al-Salem in Kuwait, Al-Dhafra in the UAE, the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters at Juffair in Bahrain. Sirens activated across Bahrain. The U.S. Embassy in Qatar issued shelter-in-place orders. The UAE partially closed its airspace. Abu Dhabi residents heard explosions. For several hours, the entire Gulf region teetered on a knife's edge, with the 2 most powerful militaries in the world trading direct fire across a theater spanning 1,000 miles in every direction. The Houthis of Yemen announced they were resuming attacks on Red Sea shipping. Iraqi Shia militias went on alert. For a brief, terrifying window, it appeared the entire Middle East was about to become a single, synchronized battlefield. Pause right here and let that land. Within 12 hours of the first explosion in Tehran, Iran had fired on American military bases in 4 separate countries. The United States had struck Iran directly. A dozen nations were on emergency military footing. And the day was not even half over. What time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to feel how many time zones are locked into this story tonight. The critical moment that defined the entire war's trajectory came just before noon on June 13, when Israeli and American intelligence assessments converged on a single, catastrophic discovery. Iran had not dispersed its ballistic missile stockpile. When the Mosaic defense doctrine was written, it assumed Iranian commanders would have hours, maybe days, of warning before a strike. The leadership would disperse. The launchers would scatter. The missiles would hide. But the leadership was dead before they could give the order. The dispersal protocols required someone with authority to execute them. No one with that authority was alive and reachable. The missiles sat in their warehouses and launch sites where they had always sat. And the Israeli Air Force, operating with near-total freedom in Iranian airspace after destroying 40 air defense systems before sunrise, was already targeting them. By the end of the first 24 hours, IDF reports indicated that 50% of Iran's ballistic missile launchers had been destroyed or rendered inoperable. The above-ground section of the pilot fuel enrichment plant at Natanz, the facility producing 60% enriched uranium using Iran's most advanced centrifuge cascades, had been obliterated. The uranium conversion facility at Isfahan was struck. The fuel plate fabrication plant, which processed Iran's enriched uranium into weapons-relevant forms, was damaged. Over a dozen nuclear scientists were killed in targeted assassinations, conducted with a precision that made clear Israel had been tracking their locations for months. Satellite imagery released in the hours after the strikes showed the Kermanshah missile base as an abstract painting of overlapping craters. Where hardened structures had stood that morning, there was now rubble. And Khamenei? The supreme leader was not in Tehran. He had been evacuated to a secure location before the first explosion. He was alive. But everyone he depended on to fight the war was not. At approximately 8 p.m. Tehran time, roughly 18 hours after the first Israeli strike, Iran launched what its commanders intended as its definitive response. 2 waves of ballistic missiles, approximately 100 in the first salvo followed by additional smaller launches, the largest Iranian ballistic missile attack on Israel in the entire conflict's history to that point. Shahab 3s. Ghadr variants. Ahmad missiles arcing through the upper atmosphere toward Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. The night sky over Israel turned into something that looked like a silent fireworks display at the edge of space, as Arrow 3 interceptors engaged targets outside the atmosphere itself, leaving white traces that residents photographed from their balconies. Around 90% of the incoming missiles were intercepted. A dozen penetrated the defense envelope. Buildings were struck. There were casualties. Real ones. The war had drawn blood on both sides in a single day. But Iran had fired its largest prepared salvo and achieved a fraction of the damage its generals had promised. Those generals were dead, and the arsenal they had promised was burning in the ruins of warehouses the Israeli Air Force had spent the afternoon systematically destroying. By the time the sun rose on June 14, Iranian state media was broadcasting defiance. IRGC commanders who had survived vowed a crushing response. They announced activation of the Mosaic defense, the decentralized fallback structure designed to empower local commanders to fight independently without a unified headquarters. It was a doctrine that sounded formidable in military journals. But it had been designed to activate before the command structure was killed, not after. The first 24 hours of Iran's war produced numbers that military historians will study for generations. Over 200 Israeli jets struck over 100 initial targets. By the end of the first day, that number had expanded to over 250. 40-plus Iranian air defense systems were destroyed before most of them ever had the opportunity to fire. 4 of Iran's most senior military commanders were killed before 9 a.m. 50% of its ballistic missile launchers were destroyed or damaged within 24 hours. 3 nuclear facilities were struck. More than a dozen nuclear scientists were killed. Iran fired ballistic missiles at 4 American military bases across 4 different countries. Iran launched approximately 200 drones at Israel, nearly all of which were defeated. Iran's first major ballistic missile salvo of the evening was roughly 90% intercepted. And through all of it, the Strait of Hormuz remained open. American warships were in position before Iranian fast boats could move. The oil market spiked but did not collapse. The choke point Iran had always held as its ultimate economic weapon had been neutralized in the opening hours before Iran could reach for it. The Mosaic defense, Iran's carefully constructed answer to the nightmare of a decapitation strike, had been designed to survive exactly what happened on June 13. What no doctrine could survive was the combination of intelligence penetration so deep that commanders could be killed simultaneously, combined with operational surprise so total that dispersal protocols never activated, combined with a covert network that had already neutralized the air defenses before the first jet crossed the border. Iran's generals had laughed at Israeli capabilities for years. They had called the IRGC's missile arsenal the ultimate deterrent. They had built an entire military philosophy around the idea that the cost of attacking Iran would be too high for any enemy to pay. On June 12, the night before the war, those generals went to sleep confident that Iran's deterrent was intact, that its missiles were in their silos, that its air defenses were online, that its leadership was in place. By the morning of June 14, the missiles were burning. The air defenses were dark. The generals were dead. The war would last 11 more days. But the outcome had been decided in the first 24 hours. If this breakdown hit different, if you felt the weight of what actually happened in those hours, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me which moment in this timeline shook you the most. Was it the generals dying before 9 a.m.? The Mossad teams pre-positioned on Iranian soil? The moment Iran fired on 4 American bases in the same morning? Drop your answer below. The discussion in these comments is always the best part. This was the first 24 hours. The next 11 days were even more extraordinary. That breakdown is coming next.